Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Workshop Wednesday. My name is Ben Kreitzberg. I am the Program Manager at the Conflict Resolution Center in Montgomery County. And for today's Workshop Wednesday, I'm joined by Jennifer Reynolds, who is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's also the Program Director for Sheppard Pratt's Trauma-Informed School Program. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. We'll be talking about trauma and conflict and the relationship between the two. And I'm really excited for this conversation, and I hope you get something out of it too, and I hope you learn a lot. So with that, I'd like to introduce my guest today, Jennifer Reynolds herself. Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
And thanks for having me, Ben. As you said, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and our trauma-informed school program has therapists at several middle schools in Montgomery County where we provide trauma-informed therapy on site to those students who have been significantly impacted by trauma and it's affecting their performance at school. We also provide professional development for instructional staff, non-instructional staff, administration. So we want everyone in the school to have a general working knowledge of trauma so that they're able to interact well with everyone.
Great. And so I want to just back up a little bit here and just sort of frame this for anyone who may be watching, who may, everyone's heard of trauma, but maybe they may not fully understand what it is or how it affects people. Could you explain a little bit about what trauma is and how it affects an individual?
Sure. So trauma is, and thank you for asking that, right? We can't quite talk about it until we know about it, I guess. So trauma is a response to a situation, an event that's extremely disturbing or distressing to the individual. So, and that event surpasses their ability to cope with it. So in that moment, there's a loss of a sense of safety, a sense of control. And there are feelings that'll come up of hopelessness, of intense fear, a threat to your life. So that's kind of the response to trauma. And the thing about trauma is that there are no rules as far as how we respond to it. So I may be affected by something that same day or the next day, or I may not be affected until 10 years from now when something brings that up. Another thing about trauma, and that there aren't any rules, is that two people can experience the same exact event and be affected in completely different ways. So an example of that would be like 9/11. So there are people who were at ground zero, who were helping, who experienced it all and were not very impacted by it. They experienced it, but they weren't very impacted. They were still able to continue to help. They were able to go to work and kind of function pretty well. And then you had people on the other side of the country, the other side of the world, who were kind of like, I will not get on a plane ever again. So it's important to remember, it's not that you have to be there and that you have to personally experience it. Just something as simple as hearing about it. Can definitely do that. And then also, not everyone is traumatized. So like I said, experiencing versus being impacted by it. So understanding that part as well. It could be the same exact situation, and just not everyone will have that traumatic kind of response, because some people just have different coping skills, different levels of coping than others. So another thing with trauma, right? It's an extreme event. So it affects your brain immediately when it does impact you. When you do have a traumatic response to it, it impacts your brain immediately and it causes literal physical changes in your brain. So if you think of, if I was about to step off the curb and almost got hit by a bus, right? And I jumped back and I didn't, chances are when I cross the street tomorrow or later the next day, I'm gonna be looking, to make sure, because I wasn't paying attention before. So maybe now I'm really gonna pay attention, right? That's because your brain has changed and it said, whoa, I have to survive, right? So these are the things I need to be super alert about. And so the way the brain, just very general, is kind of set up is the lower part of your brain, like the brainstem. That's where things like your heart rate, your respiratory rate. Very basic functions happen. Things also like your alarm system. So we hear about the fight, flight, or freeze response. That's where that happens. So in the frontal lobe, like the upper part of the brain, that's more where the more complex functions are happening. So critical thinking, executive functioning, problem solving, things like that. That's where that's happening. So that lower half is it's like a gatekeeper. So when you get information, it decides if that information is a threat, right? And if it's a threat, then it's going to activate that alarm system. And if that alarm system is activated, then we don't have the full capacity to problem solve, to critically think, for executive functioning, those higher level functions. Now we're just functioning and I'm in the moment and I need to be safe.
Gotcha.
You know?
It is really interesting to me to think about how trauma specifically affects your brain, right? And it affects you physically. Do you want to speak a little bit more on, or would you mind speaking a little bit more on, what that looks like and how it specifically can affect you?
Absolutely, absolutely. So not only does it affect the brain, but it affects your body physically, the places where you hold tension the most. There's a lot of trauma that your body remembers in a sense. So, and a lot of these things, we know that because we'll be reminded of something because of a smell, because of a season. If I lost someone really close to me around Christmas time, right? Maybe in October, because they put stuff out earlier and earlier, when stuff starts coming out and they start playing holiday music, maybe I get really sad, because I remember, like my senses remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting thinking about the different things that you might not even consider as triggers, right? That will just hit you out of nowhere, and then bam, you're right back into that experience that you went through. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Personally, I've never really. I mean, that's really eye opening for me. I think two of the things that really stood out to me about what you said in your introduction about trauma was the first thing being that everyone interprets it differently and it affects everyone differently, and everyone can have different levels of responses to a traumatic event, even to go as far as, some people may not be traumatized by the same event that may leave someone else, very traumatized, right? That was sort of, I guess if I had to talk about my understanding of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
I would probably say something in line with that. But the second part of what you were saying is really interesting to me, that, and I think it's important for other people to understand too, that it literally affects you physically, like chemically in your brain.
Absolutely.
And that to me seems, I mean, for one, powerful, right? And that's something that I think can help people, start to cope with trauma. Is that right? That once they understand that it's not necessarily something that they can help, or that that they are doing to themselves mentally, that it's something that physically happened to them.
Right. When they can understand, and it helps people who are interacting with those who have been impacted by trauma, because now we know that your response, maybe you being overly protective or defensive, isn't a choice, right? Now we know that you're not broken, right? You're just over adapted. And so just as the brain changes in that instance, if you have a person who has experienced that and now they're doing things to make sure they're safe and in control, well, if you expose them repeatedly to safe, predictable, caring situations, your brain changes again. So it's not like it just changes that one time and then all is gone. It'll take a lot longer, but there are ways to kind of change that again and reintroduce the world in a sense.
I like what you were saying about being over adapted, and that's important for people to recognize, and that there isn't, it's not the end of the world, right? When your brain does change when you go through trauma, right? There is a process, and there is sort of a light at the end of the tunnel, and that it just might take some time.
Exactly.
What are some other things you think that people should know about trauma and how it affects other people, for maybe when they're trying to help someone that they know has been through trauma, and that they're trying to help them get to that light at the end of the tunnel?
So that's a really good question. So safety is the crux almost of trauma, right? You've experienced something horrific, something terrifying, and you didn't feel safe and you didn't feel in control. So helping someone, or just knowing that, hey, this person has experienced something, or they're having these responses. What can I do to create that safety? I can have a predictable environment. A lot of times that means I can have boundaries. You have to have boundaries, because boundaries mean safety, even when we don't like them.
Hmm.
And it's not even as important to know what the event was. That's really not a factor. The most important
That
thing,
makes sense.
yeah, is to identify those who are being impacted. When you see that traumatic impact, right? You see things like, wow, that was an extreme response. I wonder what's going on. Not what's wrong with them, but wow, I wonder what's going on with them.
Yeah. And so I see what you're saying, right? People should be looking for those boundaries that maybe are or not in place, and they need to be trying to figure out, all right, how can I make this person feel safe, and where are those those boundaries for safety?
Mhm.
How do you see the relationship between how conflict might be able to come up if maybe they're doing too much of that, right? They're trying too hard to make someone feel safe. Maybe they're going over the edge, or maybe they're not doing enough to make someone else feel safe.
So what can come from that is kind of targeting and what you want to be an intentionally helpful way, but almost imposing on that person, like, I know you've been through this thing. Let's figure this thing out, right? We want to kind of back away and allow for that person. We want to empower that person to say, okay, I would like to share this, or I would not like to share this.
Hmm. Got you. So it sounds like the main thing to think about, if we're thinking about, right, there's a traumatic situation that's happened, it has created some conflict between parties. It sounds like you're saying the main thing is building that understanding about what happened and how it's affected the certain individuals. Is that right?
What happened as far as the conflict, yes, but not necessarily about the traumatic experience. That's not so important, but about the conflict, and more important, what are those things that pushed your buttons,
Hmm.
right? Help me to understand that. Like, I, took a pen off of your desk, right? And you got really upset. Like, help me to understand. And maybe they're not going to say, well, 5 years ago this happened and that happened, but maybe they'll say, I don't know, but I just don't like when people take things from my space, without asking or without saying something. So understanding and looking at those areas, those pet peeves, those things that just push your buttons, those are the places you want to look.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that sounds helpful in terms of trying to find those identifiers, right? That might spark a certain reaction, and then once you find those identifiers, work with that other person to understand why it's happening and where they come from.
Absolutely.
Got you. So could you explain, or maybe share some tips or tricks for people who are trying to communicate with someone and build that understanding with someone who they feel has been through a traumatic experience?
Yes. So the first thing is, you don't want to assume that they've been impacted, right? You want to kind of just know, if you know that they've experienced something, not assuming that, oh my gosh, they're destroyed, they might be crushed, because they may not be, right? And they might not experience that for some time. So we want to kind of have an open, safe space available if they do want to come to you and talk about anything. And another thing we don't want to do is, we don't want to kind of impose on people. So if I have a coworker whose, parent passed away, and they've been out of work for a while and now they're back, I don't want to say, oh my gosh, like, this is awful, you know,
Mhm.
talk about it, or no, 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 just go home. Like, you don't have to be here, right? I want to see what they need. If I have a student, right, who has experienced, they've just shared something really that I'm really saddened by. A lot of times our natural inclination is to give me a hug. Oh my gosh, just give me a hug, right? But I don't know what that hug means to that student. And maybe that makes them really uncomfortable, right? But I need to give a hug because I'm anxious and I can't handle what I just heard. So
Mm.
now they not only have to hold and deal with their trauma or their anxiety, now they have to deal with my anxiety.
Yeah.
and take care of themselves at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. That is interesting because, I know personally, right, as a mediator, we're trained to not put your own feelings and your own thoughts and your own beliefs onto what other people are saying or what they've experienced, right? And that's pretty much exactly what you just said, right? You should not, you know, force, your idea of how someone should be reacting or what they need from what they've experienced onto them, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
What do you think if you had to speak a little bit on, what you view the relationship between trauma and conflict to be? Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah. So it's the perception of what of what conflict is, right? So if I have been impacted by trauma, I'm going to see conflict as simply a threat, right? I might see it and nothing else is just a threat and something to defend against, something to get away from. So as opposed to seeing it as, okay, it's identifying a problem and we have the opportunity to come to some sort of resolution, right? I
Mhm.
don't have that. If I've been impacted by trauma and I haven't had a chance to kind of process that or work through that because I'm on guard. When you've been impacted by trauma, like I said, the brain is constantly on guard now,
Mhm.
and it's this constant state of anxiety and fear. We call that hypervigilance, right? So where I might lose it when I'm here, a person not impacted by trauma may be here, but the person impacted by trauma is living here. So that's a lot smaller, of a window of tolerance. And the thing about that is the person who's living trauma impacted in that way, they often don't know it, that
Mhm.
they have this shorter window. So that would be the relationship, is just how it's perceived.
Yeah. Actually, that's really interesting. That the idea that people who have been affected by trauma, and like you said, are living in that area, may not even realize the full extent of how it has impacted them.
Right.
Right? Yeah. Wow. That sounds like that is. That could create a lot of not only conflict with other people, right? Because they may not understand these feelings and emotions they're feeling when something does happen, right? And that those buttons you talked about are pushed, and those
Right.
identifiers that sounds like they might not even know exist are,
Yeah.
are being affected.
Yeah.
Yeah, that just knowing that and hearing that, I think could be really helpful for people who are in conflict, and might be that party who has not been traumatized, and especially the party who has gone through something to recognize that and think about.
Right. Because it can often be chaotic internally, right? I'm constantly feeling like I'm not safe and I have to, regain a sense of safety. So if there's a conflict, I'm defending against it. And how do I regain safety? I go on offense,
Hmm.
and I do whatever it takes. So I'm not really being productive in this conflict or resolving it. It's more like I have to be safe. I don't feel like I'm in control and I need to be safe. And yeah, it's really hard for those who aren't even aware of that.
Hmm. Yeah. So yeah, again, just going back to how important safety really is in terms of you know getting to the bottom of coping with trauma, dealing with trauma-related conflict.
Hmm.
So I think that's a great sort of piece of advice for people who are dealing with trauma, or individuals who've experienced trauma, and the conflict that comes with that is realizing that, okay, first you need to address these safety concerns and these boundaries related to safety before you can even start really getting to the meat of it and trying to come to that resolution.
Absolutely,
Agree.
because that brain just kind of takes over. It's like an emotional hijacking. So you don't even realize that you're
Emotional hijacking.
just in this, yeah, you're just in this state of I gotta be safe, I gotta be safe. Like you're not able to say, well, let me think through this. And what might happen in a conflict is if I am impacted by trauma and I am internally there, it's just getting chaotic because I don't feel safe and I don't know what to do. And someone's saying, well, think of it this way. Well, I'm trying to explain, right? That's demanding the functions of that frontal lobe, the frontal part of the brain, those demands placed on it to critically think when it's not at its capacity to do so is just going to create an even bigger threat. And it's going to escalate it more and more.
Hmm. Yeah, that does make sense. I really, that term emotionally hijacking, that really stood out to me. That's like I think that's a great way to think about conflict, and again, how it really does just take over your brain, and it changes, your responses to certain things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I want to ask you, a lot of this seems to be about becoming educated, and that people need to be educated about trauma and how it affects people, and how to deal with people who have been traumatized and gone through these experiences. Do you have any areas that people might be able to go, or resources they might be able to go review to educate themselves and to learn more about trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website, shepherdpratt.org, has a lot of information, helpful information on trauma, as well as another great resource is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, as well as NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. Those are all really great resources. And like you said, education is important because trauma, it's just really a fact of life. We're all going to face adversity if we haven't already, right?
Mhm.
And we're either going to encounter people who have been impacted by that, or we ourselves are going to be impacted by that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for those resources. I'm sure everyone tuning in, is very appreciative of different areas they can go and get more information, right? Now, I'm curious about something you said in terms of a lot of these childhood trauma, I guess, is what I want to talk about. A lot of people don't realize that they've been traumatized, as we talked about previously in the conversation. How might someone go about dealing with a situation where they may have been, traumatized as a child? Maybe they're just now realizing, wow, this experience really did affect me way more than I realized. What kind of advice would you give them on how to go about, beginning to cope with that and learn from it and move past that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, first thing first, that's huge that they even recognize that, hey, something has impacted me. Because, like I said, a lot of times those who have been impacted, they kind of just go through life not realizing that inner turmoil within
Mhm.
them. So, the best course of action would be to seek therapy, really, and not to deal with, and where it starts with therapy is it starts with right now, how it's affecting you right now, right? How can we help you to feel safe right now? What situations cause you to feel out of control, cause you to not feel safe? So that's where we would start with it. And then also remembering therapy doesn't mean forever. A lot of times people think therapy, like, I don't have time for that. It's not a whole lifestyle. Therapy to kind of help you process trauma that you've experienced can be as short as a few months,
Mhm.
as well.
Yeah. So yeah, again, going back to how it affects everyone differently, and even the coping and dealing with it, and getting to that place where you feel good about moving through what's happened to you will be different for everybody.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that, to me personally, I think that might be the biggest connection between the relationship between conflict and trauma, is
Mhm.
that there is no really right or wrong way to deal with either one, or to go about trying to resolve either one, right? And it all depends on each individual person and their own beliefs, values, lived experiences, and that those will determine how an individual should go about moving forward and looking for a resolution to either one, conflict or dealing with a traumatic experience. Would you agree
Absolutely.
with that?
Absolutely. I think, yeah, it's variable for sure. And
Hmm.
also, people have different resiliencies and different factors.
Absolutely.
As well as resources when it comes to conflict, right? I might have someone who's super supportive in my corner, maybe not that I live with or from my house, but maybe it's a teacher, right? Maybe it's my mediator. Like I have someone. So absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really great point. What other ways do you see the relationship between conflict and trauma working, in terms of let me ask, do you think if someone feels like they have a good grasp on one of the two, right? So maybe they've gone through a traumatic experience and done a lot of work processing that and moving through it and understanding how it's affected them. Do you
Mhm.
think that knowledge would transition over to maybe dealing with conflict in a better way, and vice versa, right? If someone feels like they're really good at dealing with conflict and moving through conflict in their own way, in their own process, do you think that might translate over to dealing with a traumatic experience or a traumatic event in a better, more positive way.
Right. I think absolutely. So on both ends. So knowing you've been impacted by trauma, right? And you having worked through that and understanding, that'll help you to understand what happens with you when you are confronted with a conflict, all right? Or when one is presented. That helps you to put those skills into place that you would learn in order to cope with it, and in order to stay in the moment, right? And not get pulled back into, I have to self-protection, I have to feel safe. So they'll help in that way. And I think also conflict, having a good understanding of conflict can bring awareness to, well, I know that with conflict, there's an opportunity to resolve these and to get help with these. Why is it that I jump directly to, it's never going to get better and this is the end, right? So it can definitely kind of raise an eyebrow, like maybe there's something else I need to kind of work through here.
Yeah, so and that's a great point. I think a lot of people, especially in conflict, once they learn that they typically like to catastrophize things and sort of jump to the end of, nothing can be done, this is the end all be all, realizing that there are different paths and different, ways to go about resolving things that maybe you hadn't thought of before. I think that's really important, and that's really a really positive thing for people to recognize, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just looking back on our conversation, what are some things that you think that we talked about that stood out the most in terms of, if someone's going to take away some of the things we've talked about today, what are those things that you want people to really remember and understand?
First, trauma is a fact of life, right? We're either going to encounter it in someone else or we're going to experience it. Second is I can experience a traumatic event and I don't have to be traumatized. So it doesn't always equal traumatized. And also, me being impacted by trauma doesn't mean I'm broken, right? It means I'm over adapted. And it means that instead of what is wrong with you, it's what's going on with you. And it's what's missing. What skill, what tool is missing here that I need, that I can help you build, right? Is it that sense of safety? What's that tool? Is it breathing to kind of stay calm? Like, what is that thing that you're missing, right? Is it conflict resolution? So looking at it from a skill building sense.
Got you.
And also, the thing about trauma-informed care is that it's a universal approach. So we don't want to treat one person we know has experienced trauma one way and treat another person differently. We want to treat everyone in a trauma-informed manner, right? That means we want to have healthy boundaries with everyone. That means we want to create safety, a sense of safety with everyone. That means we want to, when they're in mediation, like we want to identify those triggers and things like that with everyone. So we definitely don't want to treat one different than the other, because that's how we miss a lot of people who maybe don't know they've been impacted by trauma or aren't comfortable saying that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. I really appreciate you, coming on and having this conversation with me today. And before we sort of wrap it up here, I just want to give you the opportunity to, shout out any information you'd like to give the viewers. If there's any way that you'd like them to contact you about anything we've talked about, or where people should go if they feel like, okay, they recognize that I've been through a traumatic experience, I'm ready to start going through the process of maybe getting help for that, coping with that. Where should they go as well?
Absolutely, good questions. So they should go to a therapist. If this causes a lot of anxiety and they're not feeling safe right now, they should go to a crisis center or the nearest emergency room or call 911, of course, if they don't feel like they can keep themselves safe. Once they realize that, they want to find a therapist who specializes in trauma. You can go to our website, sheppardpratt.org, and find our different programs specializing in trauma and those of our therapists who can help with that as well. And then I can give you my email. It's jennifer.reynolds@sheppardpratt.org. if anyone, wants to reach out or have any questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. And I want to thank you again for coming on today. And I want to thank all of our viewers who tuned in to this month's Workshop Wednesday. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook for more content. We'll be posting more and more Workshop Wednesdays in months to come. And again, my name is Ben Kreitzberg. I'm a program manager at the Conflict Resolution Center in Montgomery County. We hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ben.